Welcome everyone to the Studio B podcast, first episode ever. I'm Eduardo, the Learning Technology Specialist at LDDI, and here with me are my colleagues.
Hi there, I'm Jamili, and I'm the Curriculum and Evaluation Consultant here in LDDI.
Hi, I'm Melody. I'm the Marketing and Communications Assistant here.
Great. So, how can you make learning accessible, flexible, and portable all at once? The answer, it seems to be podcasting. So more universities and educators are turning to podcast and redefining learning with this. So this is the theme of our episode today. We're going to be exploring podcast creation essentials, how to leverage podcasting in education. And this is actually a preview of what we're going to be showcasing here in our Studio B during the months of January and February, which is going to be the same thing, podcast essentials.
Yeah, so that's super exciting, Eduardo. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about the benefits of using podcasting in teaching and learning, what is going to be great about using podcasting in your classroom. We're also going to chat about some key strategies for creating an effective or an engaging podcast. We're going to talk you through some of the platforms and hosting, and also chat a little bit about how you can ensure that your podcast has good audio quality.
Sounds pretty good. We're going to learn some interesting things.
Yes, we sure are. So we're going to dive right in. And to do that, I have a question for you, Melody and Eduardo. And I'm curious, based on your experiences so far, what you think some of the benefits of podcasting are for teaching and learning.
I mean, one of the things I really like about podcasts is that, like, they're easy to take with me anywhere. Like, I can listen to them while I'm doing the dishes. I can listen to them, I don't know, while I'm just like walking to and from places. So they're really portable. I could see that being really useful for students, like, especially if you don't have a lot of time on your hands to like sit down and read something.
Right.
Yeah, I think the accessibility piece is a big part of it, which are like always when I'm doing chores or just like doing things around the house, always listening to podcasts.
Yeah.
And I've been able to learn so much in the last couple of years just by listening all day to podcasts and similar platforms.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that your experiences really echo what the research is telling us about podcasting and teaching and learning. And one of those aspects, as you were mentioning, Melody, is kind of like this idea of listening autonomy. So students are able to listen anywhere and on multiple types of devices. So in that way, it kind of bridges that digital divide in the sense that it doesn't really matter. Most people have a phone at this point in time, so you don't need a laptop or any fancy technology. And most listening apps are free, so that enhances accessibility as well. You can also kind of pause and rewind and really digest the information, speed up or slow down if there's pieces that you already know or pieces you might need to take a bit more time to understand. And you can also listen as many times as you need to, which is quite helpful. And as you mentioned, Eduardo, the accessibility piece is also very prevalent in the research. Yeah. Especially for those folks who have dyslexia, for instance, and are actually unable to read the text. They have another way of engaging with the content to kind of create an equal platform for everyone to learn the same content in a class. And next is the aid to active learning. And this is kind of engaging with course materials in advance of the class. So research is actually suggesting that not necessarily that listening is a better medium for learning per se, but if you assign a podcast instead of an article, for instance, more students are actually engaging with that podcast material versus reading the text.
Oh, that's super interesting.
Yeah. And so they come to class a bit more prepared to actually tackle the content and the questions and the activities that the instructor has prepared. So inside the classroom, we're spending a bit more time engaging with those kind of active learning activities versus recapping that content to ensure that everyone's on the same page.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Very cool. I could also see, like, in a rural or remote situation, like, podcasts are such a small file. Like, when you have like a really slow internet connection, it'd be easier to download than like maybe a huge PDF or something like that.
Yeah, it's very true. I think it's much quicker just to kind of download that podcast episode and listen on your own. And then you're so right. You can like listen while you're commuting. I think for especially folks who are living rural and remote, it's so nice to have something to listen to for that 1 hour, 2 hour commute.
Those long drives. Yeah.
I'm thinking as well, even for your posture, like when we're constantly looking at our phones or at a screen or reading, like our posture is kind of hindered by that position. So it's kind of nice to be able to like physically move your body a little bit.
And nice to be able to step away from a screen, like especially if your readings are digital in your classes, like and you have PDFs or whatever. That's more screen time. And like we all want a bit less screen time, I think, in our lives.
Well, yes. I think, that's true. That's a good point. And I think like the thing of the posture makes sense because like when you're reading, you're just in one posture, but you can move when you're listening to a podcast.
Yeah.
Totally. It's probably like even healthier.
I would think so. I really like that aspect of kind of digital health and wellness too. It's a really great way to step away from your screen. And I know there's different ways that educators are integrating it so that students are actually getting out in nature as well. So implementing that kind of land-based practice within the podcasting. So you can assign a podcast to your students and encourage them to go outside and go for a walk or sit under a tree and reflect while they're listening. And so there's ways to kind of bridge that digital wellness piece, Melody. I'm really glad that brought that up.
Yeah.
So coming back to some of the earlier statistics of the research, it's interesting because test scores tend to increase from 36% prior to podcasts to 76% following podcasts.
Wow.
So test scores for students increase once you assign a podcast as a learning material. Again, I'm not trying to suggest, I don't think the research is trying to suggest that listening is necessarily equates to like higher cognitive engagement per se. I think it's more or less that students are actually actively engaging and listening to the podcast. So they are,
They're doing the material.
doing the work.
So it probably like enhances engagement.
I think it does. And again, like it's mobile, it's accessible, like it's I think making people more excited to learn and also giving them the option to do something outside of reading. Another interesting statistic that I found, which is that like actual knowledge acquisition is actually higher in podcast listeners than in book readers. And I do think that what you're saying, like, do you know when you read a book and you kind of read the same sentence like 5 times?
You're like, what did I just read? And you feel that. That doesn't happen to podcasts so much. When you're listening to a podcast, you like absorb it more easily.
Right, I think so. And maybe there is that essence of engagement like you're mentioning, like it's a more conversational in your head, and so you have this flow, and it's maybe a bit easier to listen than to force your brain to actually it's like someone's reading for you. And leading to that, it's 90% of students in these research studies also claim to concentrate more in lectures after listening to podcasts, and I think again this goes back to the idea that they've kind of formed that base knowledge before the class. So I think it's really difficult to go into a class, engage in material when you haven't done the readings because you haven't established that base knowledge that you can then build off of inside the classroom. So I think that that's one benefit of podcasting is, again, you establish that base knowledge. So it's easier to kind of understand the information that the instructor is sharing with you inside the class. And that kind of boosts your concentration. Yeah.
Wonderful.
In one of the studies we're conducting with the Roll Remote teacher education team as well, there was aspects of, single mothers sharing that it's a lot easier to actually engage with the content. If you have to take your baby for a walk, for instance, it's much easier to listen to a podcast and go for that walk than somehow concentrate and do like a, 30-page reading while, tending to your little ones.
Yeah.
Are these all the points you were going to share?
I think that's everything.
Perfect.
That's so interesting. And I'm sure people can find even more like interesting data if they look on the internet.
Absolutely. And we can certainly maybe share some links to the articles as well afterwards if anyone wants to learn more.
Great. So let's move on to our next section. We're going to be talking now about key strategies because even now here at LDDI in our studio, when we have people coming to record a podcast, many times they ask us, how do I make a book? How long should it be?
Yeah.
How can I structure it? How can I make a good podcast essentially? And this goes beyond the tech piece. So right now we're going to be sharing with you some key strategies that will help you to create a podcast. And this is based on some research that we've done and some strategies that we have implemented in our own podcast production. So I'm going to start with a question for you, Melody and Jamili, which is this: in your experience, what have you found make podcast engaging?
I think for me, the engaging piece is usually when I'm on the bus because I have nothing else to do but to actually listen. But the amount of time as well, like I feel like I'm really drawn to like kind of shorter length podcasts. Like nothing that extends beyond an hour, I think. Like that's within my kind of realm of engagement level. Because I also feel like there's no anticipation. I kind of get all the juicy bits quite quickly. Yeah.
Yeah. I kind of like a variety of formats for podcasts as well. Like I don't know, there's a few where I really like that sort of conversational aspect, like back and forth between the hosts, and maybe they're not like super dialed in on a particular topic, but you just enjoy the like interplay between them. And then other ones that are much more like informational, like one person has done a lot of research and they're telling you about it. So it's nice that you can kind of choose like what format you want to have and have a variety of those things as well.
So one of them will be like the quality of the content. That makes it engaging.
For sure.
Quality is good. And then also how is done, I guess, like the actual personality of the people like doing the podcast. I think that has an effect too. Have you found that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's part of that like parasocial relationship that we have like online now. It's that idea of like feeling like someone is your friend almost, even though you don't know them, like you know a lot about them because you listen to them and like they tell you a lot about themselves in the podcast and things like that too.
I think there is also something to like the sound quality of a podcast, like quite calming, I think sometimes, especially those people I think who are naturally drawn to be like podcast hosts do have kind of warm, inviting voice.
The radio voice.
Yeah, radio voice. Yeah. So it's just quite like easy listening.
Yeah, absolutely. So one piece is the length. Right. Jamila, like how long should it be? Many people ask these questions. And I think you have a funny exercise for us to do now.
I do, yeah. So I'm actually going to ask these questions to the two of you out of curiosity, and then we can kind of check the research-based responses.
Yeah.
So my first question is, what do you think the optimal podcast length is?
I feel like I would maybe guess like 45 minutes based on my own preferences, but I might be like a weirdo outlier. That's the length of my commute, so maybe that's what
might have something to do with it.
Yeah.
These are good, healthy guesses. We've done these exercises in classes, actually, and we've gotten quite a mixed bag. So the options we typically provide are, less than 10 minutes, 10 or 20 minutes, 20 to 40 or 40 to 60 or over 60.
Right.
And you two are both on the money. So between 20 and 40 minutes of a podcast, you'd have a listener rate of about 31%. Okay. And for 40 to 60 minutes, it drops down to about 22%, whereas 10 to 20 minutes would be about a 15% viewership. Or in terms of engagement, how long someone's willing to engage in that content. And something I always want to segue this is there's obviously different styles of podcasts that we've mentioned before. And there's many podcasts out there, especially some of the top rated podcasts that go on for far longer than 60 minutes. So these, I think, as statistics are more for the kind of average podcaster who hasn't quite made it to pure extreme, stardom quite yet. So 20 to 40 minutes is that sweet spot.
Yeah. And like maybe a good place to start if you're like just starting your own podcast, you can like experiment with starting with that length and then see how it goes for, the specific thing that you're doing maybe.
Okay, great. So let's dive into these key strategies.
Yeah, for sure. So just talking a little bit, thinking about how you want to set up your podcast and structure it. So one of the first things that you want to think about is your message. So what actually do you want to communicate with this podcast? And you want to kind of try and define that pretty clearly for yourself, like find a core theme and articulate that for yourself so you know what you're going to talk about. And then kind of center the rest of your content around that core idea. Another thing you want to think about is keeping your message pretty concise and clear. Like Jamila said, like a 3-hour podcast, some people will be really into that. But maybe when you're just getting started, you want to keep things pretty short and like keep it clear for your listeners. And then also kind of think about how you can tie that core message back into your podcast like throughout. So you're always kind of coming back to it and recentering your listener with what you're actually talking about. One thing that will kind of help you with that as well is also coming up with like a strong structure for your content. So it can be really useful in advance of recording the podcast to kind of create an outline, create an introduction, write out some of your main points, and also come up with a conclusion. So you're not kind of left at the end going, how do I finish this? So yeah, starting with that kind of compelling introduction, highlighting the significance of what you're talking about. Like, why is this going to be important to your listener and what are they going to get out of it? And then also thinking about like, how in depth do you want to go on your topic, balancing that with your pacing or like how quickly you want to deliver the information. Do you want to stretch it out over a longer time? Do you want it to be like really snappy and quick? And then as you're kind of concluding the podcast, finding that like a strong call to action for your listeners. What do you want them to do after this podcast? How do you want them to engage further with your content? Or maybe you want them to go away and think about a specific topic or something like that. So yeah, having that structure can just be very helpful in guiding your own process and also guiding your listener through the content.
I think what's kind of powerful too is like a good a podcast for me will incite this curiosity where I want to do a little bit more research.
Yeah.
Like that history podcast, for instance, it's only 60 minutes, but by the end, I'm just so enthralled and I can't wait to learn more and kind of figure out the gaps in the podcast that I wasn't able to kind of get to in those 60 minutes. But also when I think of like health podcasts or like any podcasts, about how to make your body more functional or like fix your posture or whatever it might be, maybe they don't explicitly encourage me or invite me to do something in particular. But because of everything that I've learned, I'm so encouraged to try something else out that might work for me and to be more experimental. So it's interesting kind of like those hidden messages that you're receiving through these podcasts.
For sure.
That's interesting. And it connects to the educational piece because I think when we educate, then we want people to do something, things that we're teaching that.
I also like that a lot of podcasts kind of present this offering for you to extend your learning. Like a lot of them will have show notes where you can go and like do, they'll put their links or like the things that they use to research this. So you can go and dive in and do your own research, learn a little bit more about it. So it kind of gives you a starting point to extend your learning from there.
I like that point as well, Melody, because I think one of the biggest hindrances for educators integrating podcasting is that question of like spreading misinformation or kind of fake news through podcasts. Right. But we discussed also in our meeting earlier how it could also be useful to ask your students to engage in a podcast and to identify the misinformation. So it could also be a really interesting tool to teach students that kind of skill of identifying misinformation and navigating that in different online spaces.
Yeah.
That's interesting. It also makes it more active, more of an active endeavor. Right? Instead of people just like listening passively, they can engage with the content and think critically.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good point. So next sort of strategy I have here is to write for the ear, not the eye. So writing for a podcast can be pretty different than actually writing like a script or writing something that you're going to read. The written word and spoken word are quite different mediums. So you want to think about that while you're crafting your script. Like if you're actually, writing out what you want to say, make sure that you actually speak it aloud and sort of make sure it sounds natural in your voice. Use some more conversational language, something that's going to sound natural and engaging to your listener. Remember that you're recording a podcast, not an audiobook. Those are kind of two different mediums here. Shorter sentences can be really helpful for people to help enhance their understanding and retention. And then it's also really nice to use a direct address when you're talking to your listener. It's saying something like, you can do this or we can do this. That really kind of helps create a sort of personal connection with listeners. I think especially if it's just you doing a podcast and you don't have other folks there to chat with as well. Perfect. And so the next sort of strategy we have for you here is to use some storytelling in your podcast. So I think Eduardo talked a little bit about that earlier, but storytelling is one of these things that's like, really amazing in any kind of communications that you're doing. And in podcasting, one of the things you can try is maybe using some personal anecdotes. Like if you have a personal story that connects to your topic, that can be really engaging for listeners. Or if you don't necessarily have a personal story, maybe you can find a case study or something in the real world that brings some relevance and credibility to what you're talking about. And then you can also look at employing some hypothetical scenarios, kind of get your listeners to imagine some things about what you're talking about, explore outcomes kind of in their mind, even if you don't have like a concrete real world example necessarily.
It's incredible how we are so attracted to storytelling.
Yeah.
I used to believe like I was not like that because I like more like facts and that kind of thing. But lately I've been listening to some videos and they incorporate a lot of storytelling and I suddenly find myself being totally engaged in it. Yeah.
Yeah. And facts are so much more interesting when they're animated with stories, I think.
That too, yeah.
And you remember them better, I find too. Like if someone tells a really interesting story in a podcast, like that'll stick in my head more than just the dry fact.
There's actually a lot of research to suggest that learning and emotions go hand in hand.
Right.
So I think by kind of pulling on those emotional strings sometimes, even if it's just telling a story that might resonate with somebody, then the learning actually enhances.
One of the cool ways you can kind of help craft those stories is also through like editing. Editing is like a really important aspect of both the written word and the spoken word. When you're doing a podcast, you want to make sure you can kind of like get to the best stuff, the most important points. So, look at editing your podcast, remove those unnecessary pauses, noises, anything where you kind of go off topic maybe, and you don't want to include that. It can also help you maintain pacing and your listener interest if you're editing carefully and kind of thinking about that initial structure that you created and making sure you're kind of staying within that and keeping on topic. So in terms of how you want to edit a podcast, it's much like editing other writing. So you want to edit for content on your first pass. You want to look at the structure and everything you've said. And then in the second go around, you can work on noise issues or other distractions, but you really want to get that like core content set first before you worry about the little things. And that can also help you to create some variety within the episode. So, you can decide on that in your structure, or you can do it a little later while you're editing. You can decide how you want to mix your segments. Like if you've told a few stories, how much of that do you want to include? You can also decide that up front. If you want to say, hey, I want to do like a couple interviews, you can set that up and have some interviews incorporated in your podcast Q&A segments. These different segments that create listener interest and variety as well.
I love that idea, the teaching tool too. Like if you are an educator and you're creating a podcast for your students, for instance, like you could engage your students to ask questions about the topic and you could address those questions in your podcast potentially. That would be really fascinating.
Yeah.
Wonderful. And now we come into the last section in which we're going to be discussing platforms and hosting and also audio quality, because this is a question that we normally get, like what platform do I use? What hosting service should I use? And the good thing is that today is so easy to find platforms that are easy to use and very accessible. So this is why we're inviting people to come to Studio B in the months of January and February, because we're going to be showcasing how they can use these platforms. The platform that we recommend for creating the podcast is Descript, because it's very easy to use. It's so user-friendly. We're going to put the link so you can start exploring it, and then you can come to Studio B and we'll showcase it to you. And then for hosting, we recommend Spotify for podcasters, which also has like great analytics and different things that you can investigate there. Finally, if you come and see us here at DW, we're going to be talking about microphones, how you can improve the audio quality. Yeah. Getting great microphones today is not even that expensive. Like you could just go to Amazon and find like an $80 microphone that would do the work for you. So with that said, this concludes our first COB podcast episode. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. And I hope all this information will be useful to all the people that have been listening to us today. What do you think?
Yeah.
I hope so too.
Yeah.
Absolutely. We must encourage everyone to get playing with podcasting. And thanks for listening.
Yeah. Come join us in Studio B.